The wagons had no business being where they were. They stood in a long line across the face of a red cliff, high above the valley floor. 12 of them, and part of a 13th, their canvas bleached to the color of old bone. No road climbed to that shelf. No wheel track cut up through the rock. Yet there they sat, hitched to nothing, leaning into the stone as if a whole freight run had been lifted into the sky by one hand and set down to wait. Cora Ashby had looked at them her whole life. She had never once stood close. From the floor of the valley they seemed small, a row of pale humps on the ledge, easy to mistake for weathering in the cliff. But she knew their shape. She knew the curve of the bonnets and the spoke of the tall wheel. On clear mornings the sun found a shine up there, a hard gold gleam near the top of the line, and no one in the town below could tell her what it was. Her father had known. He had told her once, when she was small enough to sit on his boot. "That is your blood up there," he had said. "Every wheel of it, and this town would rather it fell than let an Ashby climb up and prove it." She had not understood him then. She was beginning to now. Her father had died in the last week of a dry autumn, quiet in his bed, owing money he could not pay. He was an old man by the time she came to him, born the same season the wagon stopped, raised by a mother who never spoke of it. He had married late. Cora had been the child of his gray years, and now his gray years were over, and she was 20 and alone. The morning they buried him, a man came for the cabin. Harlan Doss owned most of the town of Drybone, and he owned her father's debt. He came up the path in a good coat with 2 men behind him, and he did not take off his hat. "The note is due," he said. "Your father signed it. You are not on it, so you are not my concern, but the roof is. Be off it by dark." Cora stood in the doorway of the only home she had. "Where am I to go?" "That is a wide country," Doss said. "Pick a direction." He was not cruel about it. That was the part that stayed with her. He was bored, as a man is bored by a thing he has done too many times. He counted the panes in the window while he spoke, as if already pricing the glass. By dusk she had what would fit in one leather satchel: a comb, a wool shawl, a tin of her father's tobacco she could not bring herself to leave, and a folded square of paper he had kept behind a loose stone in the chimney, soft as cloth from handling, which she had found only because she had nowhere left to look. It was not money. She had hoped, God forgive her, that it would be money. It was a page torn from a ledger, brown with age, and across the top in a clerk's careful hand were the words that would not let her sleep: Ashby, Elias, Factor, Cedar Hollow Company. Below that, a list she could not fully read, and a single line at the bottom that she could. Consigned and unpaid, held to the account of the above. She did not know what a factor was. She had no idea what it meant to be held to an account. But she knew the name, Elias Ashby, because it was carved on a stone in the Drybone churchyard with no bones under it, and because it was the name the town used when it wanted to call her family thieves. If you have ever been handed a name like a debt you did not take out, you already know the weight of that paper. If a story about a girl and a mountain of freight no one else could reach is the kind of thing you would want to see through to the end, it would mean a great deal to us if you stayed and tapped subscribe before you go. Cora slept that night in the livery straw, because the man who kept it had been kind to her father. In the morning she went to find the one person in Drybone who might tell her the truth. His name was Amos, and he was the oldest man in the valley. He lived behind the wheelwright's shop in a lean-to that smelled of pitch and old leather, and he had been alive when the wagons stopped. A boy of 8, one of the few carried down off that cliff breathing. Most of the town treated him as a piece of the furniture. Cora had always thought his eyes were too awake for that. She showed him the ledger page. His hands began to shake before he had read a word. "Where did you get this?" he said. "My father hid it. In the chimney. He never told me it was there." Amos was quiet a long time. When he spoke again, his voice had gone somewhere far off. "Your grandfather carried the whole of Cedar Hollow up that grade," he said. "Everything a town needs to be born. Seed and salt and glass and nails. A press for a newspaper. A stove for a schoolhouse. And a bell. A good bronze bell for a church that was never built." "Cedar Hollow," Cora said. "There is no Cedar Hollow." "No," Amos said, "there is not. Because it never got its wagons." He told it slowly, and she never interrupted. 70 years back, he said, a company of families had bought their way west and pooled every dollar they had into one great supply run. Not gold. Better than gold. Out here. The bones of a settlement, crated and lashed and paid for in full. A man named Elias Ashby was the factor, the one trusted to carry the goods and answer for them. And he took the whole train up the old freight grade that used to switch back across the cliff, meaning to crest it and drop down into the green bowl on the far side where Cedar Hollow was to stand. "There was a road then," Amos said. "A good road, cut into the rock. You would not know it now, because the sky opened. A cloud burst up in the high country. The kind that falls on ground too dry to drink it, so the water does not soak but runs, gathering in every draw, until a dry wash becomes a wall of moving mud and stone. It came down the grade in the dark. It tore the road off the cliff like bark torn from a stick. It took the switchbacks, the fill, the very shelf the wheels had climbed, and left the leading wagons stranded on a bench of rock, with nothing under it, and no way down. Your grandfather could have run, Amos said. The lead teams were his. He could have cut the traces and rode out. He roped himself to the front wagon instead. He was trying to hold it back from the edge when the second flood came through. They found the wagons in the morning, marooned on the ledge like a thing in a dream. They did not find Elias Ashby. And the town decided he ran off with the money, Cora said. It was not a question. The town decided what one man told it to decide, Amos said. There was another freighter on that run. Younger, he lived. He came down off the mountain, and he said the Ashby man had sold the cargo out from under the company and vanished, and that the flood was a lie to cover it. There was no one left to say different. That man built this town on the goods he salvaged out of the low wagons before the water took them. He kept the freight road for himself. He kept the say-so. He died rich, and his family is rich yet. Cora already knew the name. She made him say it anyway. Doss, Amos said, Harlan's grandfather. The lie is 70 years old, and it still wears a good coat. She sat with that a long while. Outside, a wagon passed, and the ordinary sound of it seemed to come from another country. You said the goods went over, she finally said. You said the water took them. The low wagons, Amos said. The ones on the broken grade. Doss stripped those. He lifted his chin toward the window, toward the cliff she could not see from here, but always felt. The lead wagons never came down. They are up there still. 12 of them and better. Everything Cedar Hollow was going to be. Sitting in the dry where nothing rots. 70 years, girl, and in all that time not one soul has gone up to open them. Because there is no road, Cora said. Because there is no road, Amos agreed. And because the man who owns this town would very much prefer that there never is. She went out into the white noon light, and she looked up at the cliff, and for the first time in her life she did not see a row of pale humps she had been taught to leave alone. She saw her grandfather's freight, charged to the Ashby name, consigned and unpaid. She saw the only thing in the world that was hers. The problem was the same one it had always been. There was no way up. She walked the base of the cliff for 3 days. She learned it as a person learns a face. She learned where the rock went sheer and where it broke into ledges, where old rain had cut chimneys up the stone, where a juniper had rooted in a crack and might hold a hand. She found the ghost of the freight grade at last, or what the flood had left of it, a shelf that climbed 100 feet and then simply ended in air, sheared off clean as a loaf is cut. Above that gap, far above, the wagons waited. She was not a climber. She was a girl who had kept a poor man's house, but she had carried water up from the wash every day of her life, and her hands were harder than they looked, and she had learned in 1 week that a person with nothing left is capable of a great deal. On the 4th morning, Doss found her at the foot of the cliff, coiling a length of rope she had bought with the last of her father's coins. He had ridden out on purpose. She understood that. A man like Doss did not happen past a place. "They tell me you have been to see the old fool behind the wheel shop," he said from the saddle, "and that you have been buying rope." Cora went on coiling. "I have. There is nothing up there but rotten canvas and a dead man's shame," Doss said. "Whatever your grandfather told your father, and your father told you, it is the story of a thief who drowned running from his debts. You want to climb a cliff to prove your blood is bad. That is a new kind of foolishness, even for an Ashby." "Then it should not trouble you," Cora said, "if I go up and find nothing." For just a moment the boredom went out of his face. She saw it go. Underneath it was something quicker and much less kind, and it told her more than 70 years of town gossip ever had. He was not afraid she would find nothing. He was afraid she would find something. "That cliff has killed better than you," Doss said, and turned his horse. "When it does, I will not send men to scrape you off it. I have a town to run." He rode back toward Drybone. Cora watched him go, and then she gazed up at the wagons, bone pale against the blue, the hard gold gleam winking high at the front of that long column, where she now knew a bell was waiting to be rung. She tied the rope to her satchel and started up. The climb took her the whole of a day. She went up the ghost of the freight grade as far as it would carry her, to the place where the flood had sheared it off, and then she climbed the raw rock above it. She wedged her boots in the chimneys the old rain had cut. She trusted her weight to the juniper root, and it held. Twice she stopped on a ledge no wider than a chair, and pressed her face to the warm stone, and waited for her hands to stop shaking. Both times she thought of Doss counting the panes in her window. Both times she started climbing again. She read the cliff as she went, and the cliff told her the story Amos had told her, only truer. She could see now how the grade had died. The rock here was cut through with washes, dry gullies that ran down the face like the veins on the back of a hand. On a normal year they carried nothing. But in a cloudburst, on ground baked too hard to drink, the water would not sink. It would run. Every gully would fill and feed the next, and the whole weight of a mountain's rain would come down these channels at once. It would carry mud and stone with it, heavy enough to move a boulder, heavy enough to peel a road off a cliff. She could see where the switchbacks had been. She could see the clean scar where they had gone. The flood had not washed the grade away. It had amputated it. Above the scar, the rock changed, and so did the air. It went dry. Not the dry of the valley, which still knew rain. This was a deeper, older dryness, the kind that lives on a south face where the sun sits all day and the wind never carries damp. She understood, climbing up into it, why nothing here had rotted. Rot needs water, mold needs water. 70 years of that thirsty air had done to the freight run what it did to the bones of animals in the desert. It had not destroyed the wagons, it had kept them. Late in the afternoon, her hand closed over the lip of the shelf, and she pulled herself up onto it, and she was among the wagons at last. For a moment she could not move. She only knelt there on the stone and looked. They were enormous. From the valley they had seemed toy-like, small, pale shapes on the stone. Close to, they stood as high as a house, great freight wagons built for the long haul, their beds deep as boats, their wheels taller than she was. The bonnets had gone the color of driftwood, but they had not fallen. Someone had stretched them tight and treated them well before this journey, oiled the canvas with boiled linseed until it shed weather like a duck's back, and the dry air had done the rest. The line of them curved along the shelf and out of sight around a shoulder of rock, and she could not see the end of it. Nothing moved but her. No bird, no wind, this high, in the still of the day. 70 years of silence sat on the shelf like a held breath, and she was the one who had come to let it out. She went to the nearest wagon and laid her hand on the wheel. And she said the only thing that seemed right to say. "I am here," she told it. It took us a while. The lashings were the first thing to speak to her. They were rope and rawhide, cinched down over the loads and knotted in a way she did not know, a freighter's knots, meant to hold across 1,000 miles of jolting. They had not slipped. She drew the knife her father had carried, but she did not cut them. Not yet. She untied one instead, slowly, working the old knot loose with her fingers, because it felt like a thing that ought to be undone by hand. Then she drew back the canvas on the first wagon, and the light of the low sun fell into the bed, and Cora Ashby saw what her town had left on a cliff for 3 generations. Grain, casks of it, and sealed tins, packed in tight and true. She pried the lid from the nearest tin, and the smell came up at her, faint and sweet and alive. The smell of a granary, of harvest, of a thing that still had its soul. Seed wheat, seed corn in another tin, barley, beans in a waxed crock. She let a handful of the wheat run through her fingers, hard gold kernels, dry as the day they were poured, and she knew without being told that some of it, kept like this in the cool and the dark and the endless dry, would still wake in wet ground and grow. This was not treasure as the town meant treasure. It was better than that. It was next spring, crated and waiting. It was 100 fields that had never been planted, still asking to be. She sat back on her heels, and she began, quietly, to understand what she was standing in. She moved down the line as the light failed, and the wagons gave up their loads, one by one, and each bed raised the stakes of the last. The second wagon held the hard money of the frontier, though a banker would not have called it money. Kegs of iron nails, thousands upon thousands, each keg worth a working man's wages, because out here a nail could not be dug from the ground, and a house could not be raised without them. And men had been known to burn a whole cabin to the ash, just to sift the nails back out. Beside the nails, blocks of salt wrapped in oilcloth, salt to cure the meat that carried a family through winter, salt worth its weight in trust, and crates packed thick with sawdust. And in the sawdust, cradled like eggs, panes of window glass, whole and unbroken. Every pane the promise of a house that would let the light in instead of shutting it out. Cora had grown up in a cabin with oiled paper for a window. She stood in the dusk with a pane of real glass in her 2 hands, and she thought she might weep. And she did not, because she had begun to be angry instead, because somebody had known. She found the proof at the low, broken end of the shelf, and to reach it she had to cross a bad place first. Halfway down the line, the flood scar had cut the ledge nearly in 2, a narrow traverse of crumbling rock above a straight drop. She went over it on her hands, with her rope paying out behind her, and made the line fast on both sides, because something across the gap had caught her eye. On the broken end sat the empty wagons the flood had shaken loose, and their lashings had already been cut. A strap of rawhide lay severed clean, not rotted through. A pry bar of good steel leaned against a wheel, red with a rust far younger than 70 years. and burned into the wood of the bar's handle was a mark she had seen on every freight wagon in Drybone, on the water troughs, on the door of the man who had turned her out. A double letter, one inside the other. The Doss brand. They had been here, but never to the high head of the line, where the lead wagon and the bell stood past that traverse. The gap had turned them back for 3 generations. Some Doss hand had scrambled up a hidden climb from the valley floor to this low end and stripped the broken wagons of whatever they gave up easily, and then found the loaded head beyond his reach, and gone back down, and said nothing, helping himself to the edge of a dead town's goods, and letting the world go on, believing the whole run was rotten and cursed, and best left alone. Cora put the pry bar in her satchel. Evidence, she thought, though she did not yet know for what. She slept that night on the shelf, wrapped in her father's shawl, between 2 wagons that had waited 70 years for company. She was not afraid, and that surprised her. She lay and listened to the great silence, and it did not feel like a graveyard. It felt like a house before the family wakes. In the gray before dawn, she went on down the line, and the line kept giving. There was a cast iron cook stove, crated and cornered in wood, black and perfect, the kind a woman built a whole kitchen around. There was a breaking plow with its share still greased against rust. There were bolts of cloth in a cedar-lined chest that had kept the moths out, wool and linsey, and a length of good calico printed with small flowers. Cora stood a long moment with the calico against her arm, because it was very near the pattern of the dress she stood in, the cream floral dress she owned, and the sameness of it across 70 years went through her like a struck string. Then she came to the wagon that changed everything, and she nearly passed it by, because from the outside it was only another gray bonnet on another tall bed. Inside it was a machine. It was iron and heavy and strange, all levers and a great flat plate and a long arm, broken down and crated in parts, but plainly meant to be one thing. It took her a while to see what. She found the answer in the flat trays packed beside it, trays divided into hundreds of small wooden cells, and in each cell a little block of metal type, the letters cut backward, cool and oily under her fingers. A printing press. She had read the Drybone paper. She knew what set the words in it. This was a press for a newspaper that had never printed a line, for a town that had never held an election or run a notice or told its own story in its own voice. A place with a press was a place that meant to last. A place with a press could stand up in daylight and argue with a lie. She was weeping now and working at the same time, which she would learn is the way most true things get done. And at the far end of the line, where the shelf pinched narrow and the great cliff fell away into all that blue air, she found the source of the gold gleam that had winked at her from the valley her whole life. It hung from the bows of the lead wagon in a cradle of timber and rope, lashed so it could not swing. A church bell, bronze, the size of a washtub, green only where old rain had once found the crown, and everywhere else a deep, dull gold. She could see the casting raised on its shoulder, a line of letters, and she brushed the dust from them with her sleeve and read the words a founder had poured into the metal before it was ever meant to ring. For the people of Cedar Hollow, that they may gather. Cora Ashby laid both her hands flat against the cold bronze, and she felt the whole weight of what her grandfather had carried up this cliff and died holding, and she understood that it had never been about money. It was a town, a whole town, crated and lashed and paid for in full, seed for its fields and salt for its winters, and glass for its windows, and a voice for its arguments, and a bell to call its people in. Kept 70 years on a ledge because one lie was easier for one family to hold than the truth was for everyone else to carry. She did not mean to wring it. Her hand found the rope on its own. It was one stroke only, and the cradle held the bell fast, so it was not a full peal, only a single deep note that rolled off the shelf and out across the empty air. But the cliff behind her caught the sound and threw it, and the valley below opened its throat and carried it on. And the one bronze note went down over Drybone in the dawn like a hand laid on the whole town's shoulder. Cora stood frozen with the rope in her fist, and far below, small as ants at the cliff's foot, she saw the men come out into the street to look up. One of them, she knew even at that distance, was Doss. Going down was worse than going up. She had learned that the hard way, backward over the sheer place, feeling for each hold with her toe, while the full weight of the valley pulled at her heel. In her satchel, she carried 3 things she had chosen with care. A double handful of the seed wheat, tied in a twist of cloth, the length of small flowered calico, and the Doss pry bar, heavy against her hip the whole way down, so that she never once forgot what it meant. She came off the cliff at dusk with her palms raw and her knees ruined, and Amos was waiting at the bottom. He had walked out from town on his bad legs to stand where the grade died, because he had heard the bell. Half of Drybone had heard the bell. He looked at her as she came down the last pitch, and then he looked up at the wagons going dark against the last of the light, and his old face was wet. "It rang," he said. "In my whole life it never rang. What is up there, girl? Tell me what is still up there." So she told him. She sat in the dirt at the base of the cliff with her ruined hands in her lap, and she told him all of it, the seed and the salt and the glass, the stove and the plow, the press, the bell with the town's name poured into its shoulder. Amos listened, as a man listens to news of a child he thought was dead. And when she took out the pry bar and put it in his hands and told him where she had found it and whose brand was burned in the handle, the old man went very still. "He has been up there," Amos said softly. "Not to the top. He could never get to the top, but he has been up to the low end, helping himself all these years and calling the whole of it cursed so no one else would try." He turned the bar in his hands. "This is not a story anymore. This is a thing you can hold." "It is not enough," Cora said. "A stolen bar proves he is a thief. It does not prove Elias was not. The town will say what it has always said, that an Ashby stole a town and drowned running." She looked at her raw hands. "I need the paper that says otherwise, and I do not think it is up there in a grain tin." "No," Amos said. "It would not be." He was quiet a moment. A factor carried his book, his accounts, his bond, the bill of every load. Elias kept it in an iron box beneath the driver's bench of the first wagon, because I saw him set it there the morning they started up, and I remember thinking a boy could not lift it. He looked at her. "If it did not burn, and it could not burn, it is where he left it. Beneath that same bench, at the head of the column. The one your grandfather roped himself to." Word of the bell ran through Drybone that night faster than any paper could have printed it, and by morning the town had taken sides without being asked. Cora felt it the moment she walked in for bread. The talk stopped and started again lower. Old men she had never spoken to looked at her twice. A woman by the well, gray and straight, watched her the whole length of the street, and then came after her and caught her sleeve. "You are the Ashby girl," the woman said. "The one who went up." "I am. My name is Ruth. My grandmother came west with the Cedar Hollow families. 70 years she has been in the ground here in Drybone, in a valley she never chose, because the town she paid for never got built." Ruth's grip tightened. She used to say the goods were up there, that it was not lost, only stranded, and that one day someone would fetch it down. Everyone called her a foolish old woman. Her eyes were fierce. "Is it true? Is it up there?" "It is up there," Cora said. Your grandmother's name may be written in a book I have not opened yet. If it is, I will bring it down to you myself." Ruth let go of her sleeve as if it had burned her, and put her hand over her mouth and did not try to speak again. Doss did not send for her until the afternoon. He knew how to let a thing sit. She went to his office over the freight barn because Amos told her to go, and to go with her chin up and to say as little as a person can say. Doss was behind a good desk, with a good coat over the chair, and he did not stand. "Sit," he said. "I will stand," Cora said. "Suit yourself." He turned a paper on the desk so she could see it, and did not hand it to her. "You have been climbing my cliff. Everything that face holds, and everything on that shelf, sits inside a claim my grandfather filed and paid the fee on before your grandfather's grave was cold. The road, the rock, the wreck, the goods. It is old law, and it is good law, and it is mine." He leaned back. "But I am not a hard man. Those wagons are a danger and an eyesore, and a foolish girl's grave waiting to happen. I will buy the lot off you, whatever a court might one day say you have in it, for $200. Cash, today, you could go anywhere with $200. You could go somewhere that has never heard the name Ashby." $200 was more money than Cora had held in her whole life. She understood, standing there, that this was the true offer, and the boredom and the cruelty had only ever been the wrapping on it. He was not offering to buy a wreck. He was offering to buy her silence, and the paper hidden beneath that driver's bench, before she ever laid a hand on it. "You filed a claim on a wreck you called cursed," she said slowly, "and paid a fee to keep it, 70 years ago. A man does not pay to keep a thing he believes is worthless. He pays to keep a thing he knows is worth a fortune, and needs the world to believe is worth nothing." She watched the quick, unkind thing move behind his eyes again. "You have known what is up there my whole life. Your family has known for 3 generations. You have been stealing at a bar at a time and burning the rest of us with a lie to keep us off the climb." "Careful," Doss said, very quietly. "There is a bar with your brand on it, lying at the cliff's foot right now." Cora said, "There is a town's worth of goods on that shelf, with another name cast into the bell. And there is a box under a seat up there that my grandfather died guarding, with the accounts of every load in it." She had not planned to say the next thing. It came out of her anyway, level and sure. "I am going to bring it down. And then Drybone is going to read it." For a moment the office was very quiet. Then Doss folded his hands on the desk, and when he spoke his voice had gone gentle, which was the most frightening thing he had done yet. "That cliff is dangerous," he said. "A great many things could happen to a girl on it. And a great many things could happen to a pile of rotten wagons in a dry season, this close to a careless spark." He smiled. "I would climb quickly, if I were you, before the weather turns." She climbed again the next dawn, and this time not alone. She would not have asked it. But when she came to the bottom of the cliff in the gray light, there were people waiting, more than she could quickly count. Amos, leaning on Ruth. 2 of Ruth's grown sons, big men who worked the freight and had heard, at last, whose freight it had been. The liveryman who had let her sleep in his straw. A handful of others with Cedar Hollow grandmothers in the dry-bone ground. They could not climb the sheer with her. But they had come to hold the rope, and to stand at the bottom where Doss and his men could see them stand, so that whatever happened on the cliff would happen in front of witnesses. "We cannot go up with you," Ruth said, "but we can make it cost him something to try what he is thinking of trying. Go on, girl, fetch our town down." Cora climbed faster than she had any right to, because now she was climbing toward an answer and not only a question. She climbed the broken grade, up the sheer, over the lip and onto the shelf, and she went straight down the line to the head of it, to the lead wagon, to the tall pale bonnet where the bell hung and the cliff fell away. The driver's seat was a plank bench weathered smooth. She got down on her knees in the wagon bed and reached under it, into the dark, and her fingers found a corner of cold iron. The box was there. It had always been there. 70 years under a dead man's seat, exactly where a frightened boy had watched him set it down. It was locked, and she had no key, and she did not care. She braced it against the sideboard, and she took out the DOS pry bar, and she thought there was a kind of justice in that too, and she set the steel to the hasp and threw her whole weight on it. The old lock did not so much break as surrender. The lid came up, and in the flat morning light on that high shelf, Cora Ashby looked down into the iron box her grandfather had died to keep, and began, at last, to read. The box held paper, and paper was the very thing she had prayed for and half feared would be dust. It was not dust. The dry had kept it as it had kept the seed. On top lay a leather book, a factor's ledger, its pages stiff but whole, and beneath it a folded sheaf tied with faded ribbon, and beneath that a single letter sealed in wax and never sent. She opened the ledger first, and there it was in a clerk's careful hand, the same hand that had written the page from the chimney, page after page of it. Every load on every wagon, listed and valued and checked. Seed by the bushel, nails by the keg, glass by the crate, one cook stove, one breaking plow, one printing press with type, one bronze bell cast to order, and at the head of the accounts, the thing that made her breath stop, written plain, that Elias Ashby, factor, stood as surety for the whole. Having pledged his own house and land and every dollar he owned as the bond that the goods of the Cedar Hollow Company would be carried whole and delivered true. He had not been trusted with the town's money. He had staked his own life's worth against losing the town's goods. If they were lost, he lost everything with them. A man who meant to steal a fortune does not first sign away all he owns for the privilege of carrying it. She untied the ribbon on the folded sheaf, and it was the charter. The charter of Cedar Hollow, drawn up before the families ever went west, and signed at the bottom in 40 different hands. Some had signed with a full name, and some with a shaky mark, and each mark had a name written beside it by the clerk. She read them slowly, the founders of a town that had never stood, and near the middle of the list she found a name, and had to stop and put her hand flat on the page. Hannah, and beneath it the note, "Come west with her daughter," for the schoolhouse. Ruth's grandmother, who had told the truth to a town that called her foolish, and died in the wrong valley, and had been right the whole time. There was a last clause on the charter, in the same careful hand, and she read it 3 times before it would sit still. If the settlement of Cedar Hollow could not be raised, the whole of the undelivered freight was to be held to the account of the factor and his heirs, in trust, against the day the town might be founded at last. Elias had not owned the goods. 40 families had bought them with everything they had. But the paper put them into the keeping of the Ashby line, to hold and to answer for, until they could go where they had always been bound. It did not make her a rich woman. It made her responsible for a town. Last of all, Cora broke the wax on the letter, because she knew now who it was for. It was for his son, for the baby carried down off the cliff, for the boy who would grow into the old man who married late and hid a ledger page in a chimney and died owing Harlan Doss money he could not pay. Elias had written it on the shelf, she thought, in the wind, knowing the second flood was coming, knowing he would not go down. The hand was hurried. The words were not. "They are saying already that I will run," he had written. "When you are grown you may hear it too. Hear it and know it for a lie. I could take the lead team down and save myself and let the town's goods go over the edge, and I would be a poor man but a living one, and no soul left alive to say I did wrong. I find I cannot. 40 families gave me all they had, and I gave them my name on it. A name is the one thing a flood cannot carry off, unless you hand it over yourself. I will hold the wagons as long as there is light. The freight is yours now, and the town in it, and the truth of how it came to rest here. Bring it down when you are able. Ring the bell for me. Cora Ashby knelt on the high shelf with her grandfather's last words in her 2 hands. And she was not crying now. She had gone past crying to something steadier. She had come up this cliff the daughter of a thief and a debtor. She was going down it the trustee of a whole town's beginning, charged to carry it home at last, and the keeper of a name that had been clean the whole time. That was when she smelled the smoke. It came up the face of the cliff on the morning air, thin and blue and wrong, and she knew what it was before she stood. Down where the loaded line met the traverse, a first pale flame was licking up under the dry canvas of the nearest wagon. The bonnets were 70 years dry and stiff with old linseed, and the wagons stood hub to hub, so that one taking fire would hand it to the next straight up the line to the head. 2 of Doss's men were already backing away over the traverse toward the hidden climb down, and crossing behind them on the very hand line Cora had left strung across the gap, in his good coat, come to be sure of the work with his own eyes, was Doss. He had bet she could not carry an iron box down a sheer cliff faster than dry canvas would burn. He had bet the girl and the ledger and the truth would all go up together, and that a fire on a cursed wreck in a dry season would be nobody's crime. Put it down, Doss called to her across the wagons. He was breathing hard from the climb and trying not to show it. Put the box down and walk to the low end, and I will let you go down ahead of me. That is more than I need to offer. In an hour there will be nothing up here but ash, and no paper, and no story, and no name. There will only be what there has always been. A wreck that belongs to me. You climbed up here yourself, Cora said, in front of the whole town, to watch it burn. No one down there can see a thing but 2 shapes and some smoke, Doss said, and started toward her along the line of wagons. By the time it matters, it will be a girl who climbed a cliff she was warned off, and a fire that starts itself in dead brush every dry year. Give me the box. Cora did not give him the box. She set it down behind her, against the wheel of the lead wagon, and she stepped back to the edge of the shelf where the bell hung in its cradle over all that blue and open air, and she took the bell rope in both her raw hands. Then she rang it, and this time she did not stop. She hauled the rope down and let it fly, and hauled it again, and the cradle Elias had built to hold the bell steady let it swing just enough, and the great bronze note broke over the valley and came again, not one stroke now, but a peal. The alarm a town rings when the thing it fears most is finally happening. The sound fell on Drybone like weather. And the people below the cliff, who had been standing in a knot straining to see, understood the single thing a bell says in every language there is. Come now. Come quick. Come all of you. Doss lunged for the box. She met him at the wheel. She was half his size, and her hands were torn, and he was a big man in a rage. But she had climbed this cliff twice, and slept on this shelf, and read her grandfather's letter. And she found she would sooner go over the edge with the box than let it into his hands. They struggled against the sideboard of that first wagon with the bell still swinging above them and the fire crackling up the line. He got a hand on the iron. She got both of hers on it and set her heels. For one terrible moment the box was between them over the lip of the shelf, over the long fall. And she looked past it and down and saw, at the foot of the cliff, Ruth's 2 big sons already climbing, going up the low route, hand over hand, with the whole town roaring them on, and she knew she only had to hold, so she held. She held until the shelf gave her help. Ruth's older son came across the traverse on her handline first, and then the younger, both of them scraped raw and blowing like run horses, and they did not stop to think about it. They took Doss off her, as a man pulls a dog off a lamb. The box came back over the sideboard into Cora's arms, and she went down on her knees around it, and the two men stood Doss up between them. And all the fight went out of him at once, when he saw the low route behind them full of climbing townsmen, and understood that the whole of Drybone was coming up onto the shelf to see. The fire never got its town. It took the one wagon Doss had lit, the nearest wagon of the loaded line, and it made a great deal of black smoke doing it. But the townsmen who had come across the traverse beat it down with their coats and smothered the smoking canvas with sand from the flood scar before it could pass to the next, and the line of loaded wagons stood untouched above the smoke, seed and salt and glass and press and bell, waiting as they had waited for 70 years, patient as the dead. When it was out, the shelf was crowded with living people for the first time since Elias Ashby stood there alone, and every one of them was looking at the wagons, and then at the girl with the iron box, and then at the man in the good coat with soot on his hands. They brought it all down over the next 3 days, and the whole valley came to help. There was no road, so they made a way. Ruth's sons rigged block and rope off the sound anchor points Elias's freighters had cut into the rock, and they lowered the goods crate by crate and keg by keg the long way to the valley floor. And half of Drybone stood at the bottom to catch them. The bell came down last and slowest, swinging in its cradle over all that air, with a dozen ropes steadying it. And when its bronze foot finally touched the ground of the valley, the crowd did a thing Cora had not expected. They took off their hats. 70 years the thing had hung on a cliff no road could reach, cast for a town that never gathered, and now it stood on the earth, among the very people it had been poured to call, and grown men bared their heads to it, and did not know quite why. The reckoning happened in the street, in daylight, with the whole town for a jury. Cora stood on the bed of a freight wagon so they could all hear her, and she read them the accounts. She read the loads and the values in Elias's own hand. She read the line where he had pledged his house and his land and every dollar he owned as surety, so that not a person in the crowd could go on believing a man stakes all he has in order to steal. Then she read the charter, all 40 names, slowly, and as she read them people in the crowd began to make small sounds, because the names were their names. When she read Hannah, and the note beside it about the schoolhouse and the daughter, Ruth put her face in her hands, and her sons put their arms around her, and the thing that had been stolen from that family for 3 generations came home to it in the middle of a dusty street. Last she read the letter. She read it steady, straight through, the part about the lie they would tell, and the part about a name being the only thing a flood leaves a man who will not give it up himself, and when she came to ring the bell for me her voice did break. Once, and no one in that crowd held it against her. Then old Amos climbed up onto the wagon bed beside her, and the town went quiet for a man most of them had spent their lives ignoring. I was 8 years old, Amos said. I was on that grade in the dark, in the water, and I have kept my mouth shut for 70 years, because a scared man learns young to keep it shut. I said it once, when I was a young man, to somebody I trusted. And by that same night the old Doss had me by the collar in the dark, telling me what the river does to boys who slander their betters. I ate Doss bread after that, and did Doss work, and I did not say it again. So hear it now from an old one who has nothing left to be afraid of. I watched Elias Ashby cut the lead team's traces so the horses could run, and then rope himself to the wagon they had been pulling so the wagon could not. His old voice did not shake now. It had waited a long time for this. And I watched another man come down off this mountain who could have told you all of that, and chose instead to tell you the Ashbys were thieves, and built the roof over your heads and the fee on your freight out of the goods he stripped off the low wagons, while your town sat rotting on a cliff. You have been buying your salt for 70 years from a man selling you a dead town's stores and a dead man's good name at the same time. Go and look. It is in his barn. It is in his troughs. The mark of Cedar Hollow is cut in the wood of half of Drybone, if you have only ever been afraid to read it. They went and looked. That was the end of Doss. Not by a rope, and not by a jailhouse, though the men who had climbed with him left the country before the week was out. It was simpler than that, and worse for him. A man like Doss owned a town by owning its story, and in the space of one morning, the town got its story back and read it for itself, and there was nothing left for him to be. His grandfather's claim on the cliff had been filed to bury a truth, not to honor a debt, and a claim built to hide a fraud is worth exactly what the fraud is worth once the daylight gets to it. The freight had never been his. The charter had put it into the keeping of the factor and his heirs, to hold in trust until Cedar Hollow could be raised, and that keeping had passed from Elias to his son's daughter, to the last Ashby left standing. It was hers to answer for, not to own outright. The whole impossible mountain of it, worth more than anyone in that valley had ever counted, belonged by that same paper to the town it was always meant to become, and to her only as the heir charged to carry it there at last. Doss came to her one last time, before he went. He had lost the good coat somewhere. He looked like what he was now, which was an old man who had inherited a lie too big to carry and had never once put it down. You know what that freight is worth, he said. You could sell the nails alone and never work a day. Sell the lot, and you could leave this valley behind you and be a rich woman anywhere on the earth. No one here has ever given you a thing but grief. He almost sounded like he meant the last of it. Why would you stay? Because you have had the value of it backward your whole life, Cora said. And so did I, until I stood up there. You think it is nails and glass and a bell to be sold. It is a town. My grandfather did not die for the price of the goods. He died so a place could be born that never got to be. And it was never mine to sell. It was only ever mine to finish carrying. She looked past him, down the valley to the green bowl on the far side of the ridge where Cedar Hollow was always meant to stand. I am not going to sell the town. I am going to build it. And she did. The seed went into the ground that spring, in the green bowl beyond the ridge, and enough of it woke in the wet earth and grew that the first fields of Cedar Hollow came up gold by the following autumn, from grain that had waited 70 years in the dark to be planted. The nails and the glass and the good iron stove went into the first houses. The breaking plow broke the first ground. Ruth's family took up the plot Hannah had signed for, and raised the schoolhouse she had come west to build, 70 years late and no less real for the waiting. They set the press up in the first frame building that had 4 true walls, and the first paper Cedar Hollow ever printed carried the whole story on its front, the charter and the accounts and the letter, so that the lie could never quietly grow back. Cora set the type for the first line herself, the letters cool and backward under her fingers as they had been up on the ledge, and she was slow at it, and she got it right. And they hung the bell. They raised it on a frame in the middle of the new town, while there was still no church under it, because a town, Cora had decided, could gather before it could afford a steeple. On the first Sunday it rang over Cedar Hollow. The whole valley came, the living descendants of every one of the 40 names, and old Amos in the front with his hat in his hands, and they gathered under a bell that had been cast to gather them before their grandparents were born. Cora stood among them, and not below them, not a girl looking up at a cliff she had been warned off, but a woman standing in the town her blood had carried and died for, and finally brought down. She kept 2 things for herself out of all of it, the twist of cloth with the first of the seed wheat, which she planted by her own door, and her grandfather's letter, which she framed and hung where she would see it every morning, not for the part that cleared his name, but for the part that told her how a name gets kept in the first place. A name is the one thing a flood cannot carry off, unless you hand it over yourself. Elias Ashby had refused to hand it over on a cliff in the dark with the water rising. His granddaughter had climbed up 70 years later and refused to hand it over too, to a man with $200 in his hand and a tired lie, and between the two of them they had brought a whole town down off the rock and set it on the ground where it belonged. The wagons still stand up there, the whole emptied train of them, their canvas cut back and their beds swept clean, the smashed tail among them where the flood first stranded it. No one ever brought the great wagon bodies down, for there was no road to do it and no need, only their loads came off the cliff. Cora left the wagons where her grandfather had set the brakes. They are part of the story now, and the people of Cedar Hollow point them out to their children, pale shapes on a red cliff against the blue. And they tell them the truth of how a town came to be born late, and why it is worth climbing after the things your neighbors tell you to leave alone. So we would ask you the question the whole valley had to answer. If you had stood at the bottom of that cliff, with a name your town had spent 70 years calling a thief, and a mountain of freight above you that no road could reach, would you have climbed it, on torn hands to prove the dead man was clean? Or would you have taken the $200 and the quiet road out of town and let the wagons keep their secret and never once looked up again? Let us know in the comments, because we truly do read them, and the answer people give tells us a great deal about them. Settle in with us again when you can, and we will find you another impossible inheritance, marooned where no one had dared go, and climb up after it together. Until then, remember what a girl with nothing found on a ledge no one else would reach. The most valuable thing on that whole cliff was never the bell, or the nails, or the glass. It was a name, brought home clean. And a name, unlike freight, does not weigh a thing to carry, and cannot be bought for $200, and is the one inheritance no flood, and no lie, and no man in a good coat can ever take from you, so long as you are willing to climb.